But now it's my pleasure to welcome E.A. Ed Aymar to join us here for our first virtual craft chat of the season. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here. I have used the Bethesda Writer Center's facilities before in your classes, and when I went to school in the area, my professors afterwards would either teach classes there or speak there. So it's very cool to be on this side of the stage. Yeah.
So just real quickly, for those who may not be familiar with you, who the heck are you?
Sure. So my name's Ed Aymar. I write under two other names. I write under E.A. Aymar and E.A. Bars. The pen name's not really much of a mystery. I just don't like how Ed Aymar looks in print. And my real name is, my birth name is Eduardo, but I know me. I'm not sexy enough to pull off Eduardo. You know, I mean, you'd really have to be like a 10 out of 10 to hit that. And I
beg to differ. Like, I beg to differ, my friend.
I appreciate that, but I'm hitting like, you know, a 6, 7 at best. You know, so I'm not an Eduardo. I'm not an Eddie. No, I'm not that scale. I'm an Ed. I get it. But EA is what I like to go by. I started writing seriously in '97 when I graduated college, deceptively old, and I didn't get published until 2011. And I wanted to traditionally publish. And when I started writing seriously, self-publishing really wasn't an option at that time. So my journey was as long and arduous as you hear, and probably as many of you have experienced or are currently experiencing. So one of the things that I've done since then is taken on a lot of roles where I work with debut writers and aspiring writers to help them figure out the how to avoid the mistakes that I made along the way.
You have your book handy?
I do. So They're Gone is my newest book out. It came out last November. It's under the name E.A. Bars, or you can say Barres if you want. I made up the name, so really any pronunciation's fine. It is a story of, it's crime fiction. I write crime fiction. And it's the story of two women whose husbands were killed the same night, the same way, and the search to find out what happens brings them together. They're starkly different. One is a Northern Virginia housewife, the other a Baltimore bartender. And everything I write, it's set in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region.
Like just a couple paragraphs you could read from that in case someone does not know. Doesn't have to be much, the little snippet.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'll read the first parts of the first chapter, which is very, I write very short chapters, which I recommend if you're in need of a sense of accomplishment during your writing. 3 paragraphs and you're like, chapter done. Well, I wrote a whole chapter today. Chapter 1, winter 2019. Deb Lynn Thomas didn't understand how she'd slept through the night. Something should have woken her. The sounds of gunfire, no matter how distant. Her husband's soul ripped away. The abrupt, violent, permanent change to everything she knew. But Deb had slept peacefully and only woke when she drowsily heard the sirens outside her home. Instinctively, her first thought had been about her daughter, Kim, at Washington College. In a panic, she turned toward Grant's side of the bed, and that's when she realized he was gone. Minutes later, Deb stood barefoot in her kitchen, wearing a robe hastily thrown over the thin T-shirt and shorts she'd worn to bed, numbly listening to 2 cops tell her husband had been killed in a robbery. This wasn't something she could have imagined or accept. Now, in her early 40s, Deb was of an age when tragedy was striking her friends. Rapidly moving cancer, the slow death of parents, but not violence. It felt like the worst kind of horror, one that Deb thought she'd been spared. And not Grant. He wasn't a small man or a passive one. He'd boxed in and after college, and although he didn't have a temper, people knew better than to test him. He was popular, respected by colleagues and neighbors, always in control, physically, emotionally, professionally. When change happened, it was because of a decision Grant made. But now that notion seemed hopelessly ignorant and terrifying. Grant had been murdered, and he'd been powerless to stop it. Men who kill, Deb realized, make their own rules of law, even nature. and now the laws of her reality were unwritten. Her 19-year-old daughter, Kim, returned from college to stay with her. Deb knew she needed to be there for Kim, but for those first few days, the most they could do was cry in the same room and hold each other, as if desperately trying to stop themselves from dissolving. Deb had known Grant was going to die someday, the same way she understood she would also die, but it was impossible to accept. There, but for the grace of God, went others, not him. That's the first chapter, or parts of it.
So my first question then, so you write thrillers. Like, the name of your genre is so much better than the name of the genre I work in. Literary fiction. I don't even know what that means, and I scoff at it every time it's said. But what is plot? No, I'm just joking. I'm confused myself as to what plot is it pronounced? No, anyway. I have a few real questions for you. So before we get actually to the book, and I really, after hearing that, want to get to that, but you also host your own reading series, DC Noir at the Bar. And we're here to talk about the craft of writing. And I think an underappreciated part of the whole craft process is how we connect to each other and learn as writers. And I really do believe that something like Noir at the Bar, something like attending one of these events or an in-person event and meeting other writers and chatting in whatever capacity that is a part of the craft process. Since you're here and you do something similar, I just wanted a few questions on that to begin. So what is Noir at the Bar, just real quick, for the elevator pitch of your event?
Absolutely. So it's a nationwide event. It started in Philadelphia by a crime fiction book blogger named Pete Rozotsky. And he had this idea to have a reading at a bar and have 6 to 10 crime fiction writers get on stage and read short stories or excerpts of their work. And the stories were going to be not entirely noir, but really leaning that way. So a little bit of violence, a little bit of raucous humor, and a lot of moments where you look at the person next to you and say, did he or she really just say that? And it was, it ended up really catching on, because most readings, as we all know, tend to be somewhat staid and conservative, and this allows for a more relaxed, informal, really performative atmosphere. Honestly, nothing at times can be more boring than a reading. It's really, it is a performance, but it's just someone standing there reading from a book. Usually they're not even looking up. It's a necessary thing, and it speaks to the oral tradition of literature, but I really think it's something that we need to revisit as a group, being the writing community.
Posting your claims of revisiting the reading right now. So cheers to that idea. But why is it important to you as a writer? And sort of speaking from a greedy perspective, what do you get out of it? What brings you to keep doing it?
So I tend to do a lot for the crime fiction community, and that isn't because the reason for that is because of the support and the enrichment that no, I'm just kidding. I like the attention. I like the attention, and I like the praise, and I like people saying, wow, Ed does a lot of stuff for people. But, look, everything I do in writing, I hope it benefits myself. I'm not enough of a egoist to put my name on everything and say, Ed Aymar did this, or, Ed Aymar was running this event, and you should buy his book. But I wouldn't do it if in some way it didn't help professionally. That said, I'm not that cold-blooded. There are things that I've done in the past where you don't put your name, or you're just helping people. It's fine. It's fun. It's encouraging, and you learn from it. You learn so much from these events. One thing I learned is, I didn't consider myself I don't consider myself a strong short story writer. So doing these events is a way to really see how other people are doing it and steal from them, and how to be a good performative reader, which is so important. To actually, most writers are not good readers. It's a completely different skill set. It's nothing against the writer. It's just we're generally introverted nerds, and introverted nerds don't do well when you're on stage or on screen. This gives me a chance to kind of try and shed that and to see what others are doing, and steal from them shamelessly.
Shamelessness is the key to all literary events if you're hosting them.
Absolutely.
I like, though, that you mentioned the hearing other people read, because I think that's also beneficial, like not just in the performative aspect. If you hear anyone read out loud, I feel it's similar like when you read your own work out loud. You're picking up on, even if you can't point to, well, this should be edited, your ear is being trained every time you listen to someone read out loud. And I think it is a good practice. Maybe that's not a fun event if you're going to a reading thinking about practicing your ear, but it is useful in that way for me too, to hear other people read, especially when it's someone who is a good reader.
Yeah. I mean, it really comes into, the best readers that I've seen at these events tend to have some sense of an acting background. They're just comfortable with the stage, and it's a lot to ask of someone, but really, I mean, just rehearsing what you're going to read, making sure that it's self-contained is a lot. I've seen writers who will give background to what they're going to read that lasts longer than the reading. That's not where you want to be. So all this stuff is good to see at events like this, and at really any reading, and it helps you figure out, too, what the importance of connection, like you mentioned. I mean, this is a very lonely and very dispiriting business. Writing has a lot of rewards. Publishing does not, unless you're a jerk. But for most of us, publishing is a haul, and there are rewards. And then the moment of it, the moment of a great review, a trade giving you a starred review or something. I mean, honestly, that feels good for a long time, but it passes, and then you're on to a rejection a day later. It's really, these events are a great way to meet the community and to see that everyone is going through this, and everybody's feeling this way, and everybody's gone through this, and you're not alone. And that was important for me when I wrote from 97 to 2011. I imagined myself like in a cave. Nobody knew I was writing. None of my coworkers, none of my friends, the people I was dating at the time, they knew, but I didn't go out at night because I came home from work and I wrote. And I wasn't a great boyfriend. So there was, and I assumed when I finished this book, I would come out of my writing cave like Moses with commandments, and people would be waiting for them. And they were not waiting. And the commandments I wrote didn't get published. So I may have gone about it the wrong way. And as I mentioned in the beginning, one of the things I want to do is help people not make those same mistakes.
Yeah, I love that. And I love too the practice before you read. I think that's the thing that, I mean, yes, you should be reading out your work out loud, and so you should have some ability to read it out loud just because you've been doing it yourself as you go through revisions, but giving a reading is a whole other beast. And if you're the person on a read, I can tell the person who practiced their reading before they showed up. Every time I go to a reading, that person stands out, and the other ones, and that's who sells a book if it's 7 people selling books at one event too. So it's also capitalistic and practical. So.
And don't you mind, Zach, a question for you, if you don't mind. You mentioned, the importance of reading out loud. I find that from writing it to typing it to printing it out to reading it to putting it in a different form, like reading, a friend of mine sends her books, as she's working on them, to her Kindle and reads them on that in a PDF form. I don't know about you, but for me, it changes it changes how I perceive it every time.
No, absolutely. Like, I mean, I've always been on screen. I have to have printed copies. I'm sorry, environment. I'm sorry, trees. But I have to have at least several drafts that go through a physical object in my hand. And I always have a very different experience reading that than I do the one on my computer. Like the way you see that page is completely different than the way you see it. I mean, first of all, it better reflects the shape of a book that you will eventually hold, as opposed to the screen's the wrong shape. So Kindle, I think, would be a good variation. I know writers who will drastically change the font and the size of the font so that things don't end up in the same place on the same pages, so that everything gets, so that helps with page breaks, because often in page breaks, you miss the things you can see on a single page. Yeah, so I've heard so many great techniques, and any technique that makes you see something different, I think is helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's talk about craft. We talked about this. We talked about craft. That's craft. That is absolutely craft. Let's talk about craft in the more traditional definition of craft, which is the writing itself. And this is a new question I want to try out this year to see how it goes. So you're my guinea pig. I apologize for trying it first on you, but what's something you do as a writer that nobody has ever seemed to notice or comment on before? And as you're thinking, that's either in general or specific to this book. For example, in my latest project, throughout the book, I found ways to have two words in the same sentence that claim little anagrams of clusters of letters. I don't think anyone will ever notice that. The title of the book is The Migraine Diaries, and there's an RAI in migraine and an IAR in diary. So I was like, let's play with that and see what happens. And it's not super deliberate, but probably every chapter has one or two instances of that occurring where I deliberately found a way to throw in a word that might have not been my first word choice. And maybe no one will know, but I know, and it makes me happy.
So all of everything I write, I'm greatly envious of, and this is very common for genre writers, writers who write series of books. It seems to me very difficult because I can't imagine maintaining interest as a writer, much less a reader, for 10 or 15 books. When it works, though, it's that sense of comfort and familiarity is really lovely. And I think that's something that as readers, we latched onto early on to books. This other world that we loved and identified with and returned to frequently. As kids, I think we always reread books. I don't do that, and I don't do it. I don't do series. I mean, and I don't do it for a very practical reason, because I don't think it is commercially sustainable. It's what every writer does. It's what every publisher looks for. But more often than not, I see series tend to fizzle out after 3 or 4 books, traditionally because they lose, for a business reason, they lose readers. Your funnel as it goes is going down, and the publisher is losing interest. So it's a very hard thing to maintain. What I do in my books, though, and what I feel I need to do, and not something that people notice, is I create a shared world. All of my books and almost everything I write takes place in the same universe. And I try to link things from other books in there. The main bad guy, and not the main bad guy, but one of the bad guys in They're Gone is a character who appeared in my 2019 book, The Unrepentant. And he got severely burned in that book and appears in this book. And I wrote that and I thought, man, that's too obvious. But either people didn't read The Unrepentant or they didn't remember it because nobody picked up on that but me. And then when I mentioned it, people were like, oh yeah, that's right. But yeah, I like the idea of, kind of what Faulkner did with Yachna, with his county. With Y County, this idea that all these characters, I love that minor characters will mingle and reappear, and that someday, if you have a body of work that somebody wants to investigate, they'll be able to map this out. So I'm mapping it out, and maybe someday someone else will. That's nice to think of, but it doesn't really matter. It's just fun to do. It's fun for me.
Were you a comic book reader? I'm just asking because there's so much of, like, I didn't read comics until an adult, but I did read them, and I sort of, in some of my early work, I had the sort of same shared universe, but it was sort of like, this is Metropolis and Gotham City kind of writing, where these things are happening in these made up cities. I didn't even name them, I don't think, but like, so I was making it my own cities, but they would, interfeed, little bits of other things would seep into others. So were you a comic reader at all, or?
Oh yeah. And I still read them, but not to the extent that I would like to. Honestly, the really disappointing thing for me, right over the past couple of years, is that I really haven't read much outside of crime fiction. And that includes comic books. There's a lot of graphic novels I'd love to dive into and explore their larger worlds. And I just don't have that much time. I don't have a lot of time to read during the day. So the time I do have, I have friends who've written books, and there's books that I'm asked to blurb, or the hot new book out. I want to read what everyone's talking about, and it's just hard to read outside of that.
So I made a joke about what is plot, but then someone commented in the chat they would actually like to hear your definition of plot. So how do you define or describe or explain plot?
I can't offer you a really succinct definition, but what I can say is the way I view plot, there's two things. The first is it was a lesson I had when I was in college, and I was taught by, I studied fairly extensively under Alan Chuse at George Mason, who some of you may know. He was a figure in this area, and he was on NPR's All Things Considered as the book reviewer. And he was just a very harsh teacher. He ran his workshop. It was like a pool of sharks. I mean, you went in there and he encouraged negativity, which is very, very difficult, but it was helpful. It's not the way I would teach, but and not the way I'd recommend, but it was kind of the Bobby Knight school of writing. And he would every week, he'd read somebody's short story, and you could either read it or he would read it. And one of the guys in the class, who was sort of a cocky young writer, said, "Yeah, you can read it." And Alan picked it up, and he looked at the first page, and he tore it off and crumpled up and threw it away. Then he looked at the second page, threw it away, and the third page he started reading. And he stopped and he said, "What did I just do?" And we were like, "Well, you're kind of an asshole." But no, that's not what he did. He started where the story started. And that was, for me, one of the things I always think about when it comes to writing and when it comes to plot. You've got to start where the action is, especially if you're writing crime fiction or thrillers. The other thing I think about when I think about plot is how I want my books to be considered. And this sounds like I'm being demeaning to myself in my books, and I'm not. I want my books to be like fast food. I want you to start it, and I want you to wolf it down, and just, in just a rush, a hedonistic rush. And then I want you to feel a little, uncomfortable afterward. I want you to think about, what was that? What did I just, I wanted to sit with you for a while.
In the case of gassy fiction, is gassy fiction a derogatory term for?
Gassy fiction is the genre that I'm maybe not what I would title it, but you're very close. But that's what I think about with plot. I think about, for me, that's how I view a plot. I want something that is going to completely engross you and then sort of leave you discomforted.
You mentioned pacing there a little bit, and there was a question about pacing as well, and I had a couple questions about pacing. So the excerpt you read in the book at the beginning, so the first several chapters of the book, we're not to action yet. Yeah. We're in this and we're actually dealing with grief. So it's the opposite of a thrilling moment. So I was wondering how just sort of your thoughts on pacing in general, thinking about, in particular, this novel starts not thrilling. You're sort of chronicling a grieving process, and then a more complicated grieving process of a sorts for your other character in the next chapter. How does the pacing of this book work, and how do you sort of think of pacing in general?
I think about it sometimes, and I think it should have been paced differently. I'm not afraid, published, removed, a year removed from the last edits I did, and really the last time I read it. I can look back and think like, maybe it should have started with more of a traditional thriller opening, but it wasn't the book I wanted to write, and it wasn't the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell a story about grief, and I wanted to have that resonate. I hate, one of the things I really hate, and it happens a lot in crime fiction, is when death is minimized. I don't want to minimize death, and that's going to happen if you write crime fiction. It sometimes, especially if you have the number of bodies in a book that I do. you want to, but you want those bodies and those lives to count. And I really wanted this to count, and there's a reason for that I never really realized. You mind if I expand on that a little bit?
Oh, please.
So my last book, The Unrepentant, was about a woman who escapes from a group of criminals, and she stumbles upon a person who, an older man who helps her, and then she ends up helping him more so, because I sort of wanted to subvert that trope. And then this book deals with these two women who've lost their husbands. And I didn't know this until a reader pointed it out to me, but I have one kid. I have a 6-year-old, and that first, the Unrepentant was very much about, I didn't know this, but very much about my experience of protecting someone, of being there for someone. And this book is very much about my, and I did not know this, again, my fear of not being there. So I wanted to study that grief, and I was, somewhat morbidly curious about what the family would feel like without that person there. Although the missing men aren't really central to the story.
I loved your comment early on too about the having death mean something, because one of my least favorite things in, say, an action movie is the who's going to die next plot.
Yeah.
And so that's not the case, hero or villain, in your book. There's some weight given to any character who's facing a mortal situation. So that was also an interesting and well done, I thought, technique. So yeah. There's some more questions coming in, so I'm going to do one of mine and get to a lot of those, I think. So right before I read your book, I had read this book, The Sprawl by Jason Diamond. So I was thinking the Suburbs were fresh in my mind. This is the book about suburbia. It's an essay collection. And your novel, a lot of it is set in the DC suburbs. So I guess, why did you choose to feature this setting, and sort of what are the advantages of a banal setting like the suburbs, someplace that is polished and safe and boring, for in quotes? What's the benefit of that for a thriller? How do you use that as something to contrast or compare or whatever?
Well, part of it is that it's identifiable, right? It's where I identify with now. When I was starting to learn writing in my 20s, I spent all my time in Baltimore, and I went to I made a point of learning every street in the city and walking down every one. And that was in my 20s. I'm in my mid 40s now, and I haven't been to Baltimore for years. But I'm in Northern Virginia, which is depressingly suburban. And setting a thriller there, I mean, I don't get that same sense of appeal that others do, where they're like, I'm going to subvert the suburbs. That's not really my goal. I mean, we all know there's rotten people in every walk of life. I don't think anybody views, I mean, some people might, but I don't think anybody has at this point a enchanted view of suburbia. We've dispelled ourselves of that notion, I think, as a country. But there's, it also, I'm one of the things I said, earlier, that I wanted to write against a certain trope. And I really, really, really dislike the male hero nowadays in books. It's kind of like, I don't want to name a writer, but I'll name a show. If you remember Kiefer Sutherland in 24, He was pretty much a sociopath. He was awful. All he did was kill people and save the world, which is great. But I was like, what is this guy like on a Friday night? I mean, does he like watch a movie? Does he have pizza? Why does he have friends? Who would be this guy's friend? Like, what is his life outside of all this stuff? And that was something I really wanted to write against. I want to write about generally people who are in situations that are somewhat overwhelming to them. I don't like my protagonist to be a step ahead of the crime. I want the crime to be engulfing them and sort of, I want them to have my reaction, which is to cower under a desk. But a little more, something that's a little more interesting for a reader versus a 46-year-old man hiding under a desk and saying, I have a wife and kids, take them.
I'm going to be a little disappointed if that is not the plot of your next novel. It'll be like The Room, but it'll be called The Desk. And so let me hop over to the chat real quick. So we have one question here. Like, do you have any ideas that you return to for keeping your crime fiction fresh? Do you find the form liberating in a way?
Ideas that I return to keep it fresh.
An idea or a technique maybe, or anything like that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is such a cliched answer, but it's really character first, and actually it's not cliched, because when you write, if you want to write a thriller and you want to write crime fiction, you're going to hear a lot about the elevator pitch. You might hear that in any kind of fiction. When you're trying to sell your work to an agent or to a publisher, what's the elevator pitch? What's the 2 to 3 sentences that will latch somebody on and make them want to pick up the book? I never have one of those, not one that I like. I wish I did. I wish I had something that was like, well, there's a bomb going off here and they have 5 seconds to stop it. And also there's, I don't know, rabbits. I never have that approach. Instead, I'm like, well, there's a 40-year-old housewife who lost her husband, and and right away you're kind of like, oh, okay. And this is a thriller. I don't get that. I go from character first, though, and character to me is where the plot comes in. I need to see this person in a situation that he or she doesn't want to be in, and I wish I thought of the plot first, but it's the character first, and but I think that's important. If you look at crime fiction right now, the top genre with subgenre within it is psychological thrillers. You think Gillian Flynn with Gone Girl and Laura Lippman up in Baltimore, and all these writers who are Megan Abbott, who are writing terrific work, and it's psychological thrillers, and they're character dives. That's I think what readers are gravitating towards, and that's a wonderful thing. There's still the plot heavy books out there that are going to find their readers, but I love that this is becoming more prevalent for my genre.
So a writing practice question. You mentioned time. How do you manage your writing time?
Well, I'm a pretty deadbeat dad and lackluster husband, so I tend to just make the time. No, that's not it. I mean, those are true, but some writers do a word count per day. I don't do that. I do a couple hours. Like I said, I have a full-time day job. I have a family I do like to spend time with. There's a lot of good TV shows. I don't have the luxury really of writing when I want, like I used to before all this. I have to write, a couple hours a day. I have that time, and that's it. That's all I can. That's what I got, and I have to make it work. And the nice thing about being published is, and having an agent, is I have people depending on me. That makes it a little more real in some ways, right, than before when it was just for myself. It's for myself, but this is also it's a job now. And that's great. I wanted it to be a job for years. So that's not in any way any kind of a demeaning comment.
And just throw in too, because I probably repeat this anytime a question like this comes up too. I once went to a talk with a National Book Award winner whose name I've forgotten because I'm not very good at my job. But she made the point, someone asked her a question, she's like, oh no, sometimes 2 weeks go by and I don't write. And then an author I know, Amy Bender, one of my favorite writers, she once said that she writes for 2 hours every day. Sometimes that means she sits in front of a computer and just stares at the screen, but those 2 hours are her writing time and she doesn't allow herself to do anything else. I guess the point is there isn't a single way to take care of your time. I think it's a great question to hear other people's opinions, but the answers I've heard from so many different authors, there's not a single answer. So it's listen, ask that question because it's a good one, but then also play around and see what ends up working for you from the answers you find.
One tip that I heard that I'd love to share, a writer I know, Hillary Davidson, said this, and it's if you write by a word count. I don't, but if you do, most writers I know are like, I got to get my 1,500 or 2,000 words a day down, which seems really daunting. She said her goal is 200 words a day. And I thought about that, and she's like, I never do that. I always do more. But 200 a day, I'm like, okay, if I'm having a bad day or whatever, yeah, I can do that. I can knock that out. That's a paragraph or two. But she never just does 200. It's always, 1,000 or whatever. And I thought, what a great technique that I'm not going to use, but maybe somebody here will enjoy it.
I've learned so many techniques that I don't use for writing practices. Yeah. So a practical question, who did your audiobook and were you happy with the process?
Yeah, so I will I'll tell you something, since this is really a writing kind of insight thing. The audiobook was sold by my publisher to an outside audiobook publisher. They sold it to Dreamscape Audio, and they did the audiobook. And yeah, I was very happy with it. I thought it was great. They gave me a choice of narrators. I listened to the samples, the whole everything you hear about it. So that was really nice. I get very squeamish about my own writing. So I've never really heard the whole thing, and I should know what's being put out there with my name on it, but I'm just a little like, I don't know. The thing that's private that I don't want to say is I've been fortunate to have good trade reviews. I've never read them. I am way too, if somebody says something nice about my writing, I just cringe. I'm not an introvert. I'm very much an extrovert, but I don't know how to respond to it. It's like getting a really great gift and you're like, you shouldn't expect, you just go, oh, thank you. Thank you. And it's not, I don't know what to do, man. I get so freaked out. So my wife actually reads the blurbs or the reviews and then tells me what to pull out to use for like, a blurb for the book or something. But I just get really, I don't know. I can't do it. So with the audiobook, the same thing. Like, it's just really unnerving to me to hear my own writing back to me. So I haven't listened to it, but I heard a little bit and it sounds great. Seems like she did a good job. I don't know. Maybe she totally screwed up the rest of it, but
I'm with you 100%. I listened to the very beginning of the audiobook to make sure it seemed okay, and I got to choose from a list of different people who I thought was best, and never gonna listen to it. Never.
I mean, we should though, right? I mean, you should know what, like if somebody says, wow, they really butchered you should know that, but on the same token, I'm like, I don't know. It'd be kind of weird. It's like I heard a rapper once making fun of other rappers who like bump their own music. And I was like, yeah, that would be sort of weird to be like singing along to your own songs. Maybe it's something like that. I don't know.
I can't do it. I should. I'm not a very good professional writer. So that's what I'm going.
We're all learning, man.
We had a question. I have a question in the chat, and I think I feel like that could be a whole conversation, so I might focus it a little bit. So the question is, I'm interested in how you build suspense in your writing. And I think you could probably talk about that for hours on end with different ways, maybe not. But I wonder if is there maybe a single technique that you rely on to build suspense, or single method you use to build suspense, something you're really cognizant of as you're writing?
Yeah. Oh yeah. One of the things that I learned late is that cliffhangers are not bad. Everybody thinks of a cliffhanger as like this sort of over the top device that's used, that is a little too much. But it doesn't have to be. Everything you read that you like, whether it's, I was reared on literary fiction. That's my, it took a while for me to go into, I wanted to write literary fiction. It took a while for me to get into crime fiction. But even, the best literary fiction, when you can't put down a book, when you're that, compelled by it, it's because the writer's using suspense and cliffhangers, even within chapters, not just at the end. I like to end chapters with cliffhangers. It's very much something that's common in crime fiction and very common in thrillers. But to me, it's not, it can be artificial, but to have a really well done one that's gonna, because it can't just tie in the plot, right? It has to tie in the emotion. Everything in the story has to be driven by the emotion of the character. The plot doesn't have to really be moving if the character is deeply affected by something. And that itself you can use as a cliffhanger. So that's one thing that I really recommend writers look into, is if you're ending a chapter and you start the new one, why is the reader going to keep reading? What's propelling him forward?
I have one question here that I think is kind of interesting. So, what kind of research do you usually do before or during writing? And has research ever changed the direction of a story in a way that surprised you?
Yeah, so I'm still, I mentioned the Unrepentant, and that was the first book I ever did a lot of research for. And I did a lot of research into sex work and sex trafficking, which makes it sound very dirty, and it wasn't. It also makes it seem like I was some kind of like really cool writer guy, like walking down alleys and saying, "Hey, Dolly, $5 for a story," or something, and that wasn't it. I was here talking on my phone. It wasn't anything that was that cool. But that research affected me so much. It was so brutal and so distressing that it changed the way I looked at the industry, and it changed the direction of the book. And it changed everything. Honestly, it was a defining thing for me, because it changed the way I view the relationships between men and women, and the reason I don't have men as the heroes in my books, frankly. It's very hard to read about what happens to sex trafficked women and children, and put a man as the hero of the story you want to write. Generally, the research I like to do is geographic. I find that I'm not one of those writers who can use Google Maps. I have to walk on the street. I think it's so cool when you're reading a book in your area and you're like, "Hey, I know that Target," or something. I want to give that feeling to people, and I don't think I can give it unless I feel it. So I want to walk down that street and look at the building and see it. And sometimes the coolest things happen. I remember I was writing about a neighborhood in Baltimore, and I put a bookstore in the neighborhood, and 2 months later, a bookstore was announced that it's going to be built in that neighborhood. And honestly, I like to think that there was some kind of magical intuition or connection there. Realistically, I probably saw a sign that stuck in me, like, "Coming soon." But that's the kind of research I like to do, where I feel so intimately connected with an area that I feel I can convey it that honestly.
So, can you write a chapter in your next book about me winning the lottery, since apparently you
Yeah.
have like prognostication abilities with you?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate. You will get a cut.
The cool thing is, if you ever win the lottery now, I'm gonna get a cut. So
you have to write the thing first.
Well, okay.
It can't just be spoken. This is a non-binding contract on this video. I'm deleting this video right now. Sorry for those who want the video. It can't exist. I can't get a cut of my lottery winnings. I can't concentrate now. Okay. So Blake has been working on a thriller for longer than I want to admit. And I know how I want it to end, and I have a beginning, but struggling to fill in the blanks, which Blake, first of all, I feel like you are not alone on this. So, and can you speak to that at all? Having a beginning and end and needing a middle.
It's such an individual thing. And I think, Zach, you can talk to this as well. I mean, every writer does it differently. I am an incredibly detailed person. I'm still the only person I know who has like a day planner that I fill out and I do that for my weekends. Like I need to be very structured. Otherwise I get intensely nervous. Having a kid is wonderful for that. But by the way, because they're so structured and routine. So I say all that because I'm a heavy plotter. I need to have every chapter. I need to know what I'm gonna do with that chapter. Stuff will change as you're writing it. The characters will change. Things will go in a different direction, but that's fine. If I'm just writing without any sense of where this is going, it's writing that's gonna get thrown away. There's not much that's gonna be salvageable there. Maybe a nice turn of phrase or something, but it's generally garbage. I need to have I need to know how I'm gonna get from here to there. And when I'm doing that, I have to know how everything in every chapter is going to be interesting and necessary. If it can't just, I mean, you will have a thing where you're like, and then he goes from here to here. but at least you'll know that, and you'll know like, okay, and then and parts of your brain will start filling it in. You'll be surprised when you go back to write it, part of your brain has already figured this out for you. That doesn't always happen, but it happens a lot more than you realize. The story just grows in the back of your mind and forms. So I would recommend that. I'd recommend, if you haven't done it, doing a really heavy outline of it, and then following that. What about you, Zach? I'd be curious to know what you think about this as well.
I mean, I think that is a great method. It is not what I do personally. My books are not necessarily heavily plot-centric, and I tend to, I think I have it sitting right here so I can pull it out. So I tend to, when I first start a project, draw something along just a story arc with a very few small points of things I sort of know I want to happen. That just sort of gets me started, and it's very minimal, and it usually doesn't last more than, a few chapters in before I start getting into something else. And I'm a person who writes to figure out where it's going. But the Japanese author Haruki Murakami has a quote that I've always liked, which is, if I write a murder on the first page, I have the next 300 pages to figure out who did it. So the writing of the page, and if you've read his writing, if you think I don't have a plot, he definitely doesn't have a plot. So it's also a value statement about what you value in writing and in your writing, not in necessarily what you're reading. Because I was raised on, you were raised on, like I was raised on sci-fi and fantasy, and so world building and some things that definitely influenced my writing, but the plot part of those books didn't stick with me quite as hard as some of the other things. And again, it's a thing that try multiple techniques. I think don't be afraid to write something that's not going to work. Maybe that's my one piece of advice. Like, it's okay if the thing you write ends up getting pulled out and you got to start again. That's part of writing. I delete as much, and I'm a huge reviser too. So I also know that the thing I'm winging isn't necessarily going to be very good.
I would also say don't be afraid. A lot of the people who don't outline, don't do it because it dispels some of the enchantment of writing for them. And there's no wrong or right way to do this. There's no one way. I worry about that a lot. But what I find then is that when I have an outline, I have a very structured plot, and then something will occur to me. And I'm like, you know what? If that person died, that would throw the whole story. I mean, that would destroy everything. And then I'm like, well, crap, now I got to do that, don't I? And it doesn't really honestly alter, it doesn't destroy the outline. It just, it kind of charges the story up. So I would, caution people that if you're worried about outlining for that reason, you'll still surprise yourself. The outline isn't the book.
That's a good point too. So we're getting up close to the end. I think I've hit all the questions. I think there's one we may revisit after we're officially done, because you hit it a little bit from before a latecomer arrived. So, but I just want to ask real quickly, because another thing that you write violence, and violence, I think, is one of the hardest things to write. And you've already, I think, clarified this some because you have such care for characters, and you mentioned you didn't like meaningless death or just death for death's sake. But how? So, spoiler alert: the book does contain violence, and it's not overbearing by any means. I think anyone would do this. It's by any modern standard of television. It's not overly violent, but it's there. And so what is the point of literary violence, and what do you try to accomplish when you show the violence that you do show?
I'm really happy you asked that question, because it's something I do like talking about. I'm not opposed to needless violence. I'm not opposed to the Steven Spielberg, Indiana Jones, massive amounts of bloodless deaths. I think if that's well done, that's terrific. I'm also not opposed to gratuitous violence if it's done well, or graphic violence if it makes you feel if it makes you feel the way that the person wants you to feel. These are broad statements. What I don't like is clumsiness or sloppiness in writing. I want people to do well what they set out to do. So I want for my books right now, for the books I'm writing, I see violence a certain way, and it hasn't changed for the books. I see violence as altering, and as terrible, and as a life-changing thing. I mean, I think we've all experienced violence in some way, or we've seen it, and even seeing it changes you, right? And that's sort of where I want my books to be. I want the violence to be central. It's going to be something the characters learn from and experience, and probably at some point utilize. But if there's characters who are easy with it, then I need characters who aren't, and then I need to show the reactions they have against each other with that. In this book, there's a character, in They're Gone, there's a character, one of the characters' brothers, who is proficient with violence. And the other characters sort of react off that. For me, that becomes more of a study of violence, which is what I want to do. I mean, there might be a time where I write a book where there's like a machine gun guy who just blows away a whole room and everyone and cracks a joke at the end. But I don't think that's the kind of thing that I'm adept at and that I want to do right now.
Yeah, I like that. So I believe that brings us to the end of the formal part of the evening. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. And before thanks, I should say, Amy just posted again the link to purchase the book from bookshop.org. So please order a copy online or go to your local independent bookseller and ask them to get you a copy there, and support local bookshops and support Ed and writers everywhere. So Ed, thank you so much. This was fantastic.
I can't thank you enough. This was terrific. I mean, your questions were awesome, and I'm just so honored to be here, really. Like I said, the Writers Center has been this is a bucket list thing for me. So this is really terrific. Thank you so much.